All right. In this lecture, I'm going to be talking about bone tissue. I'll be talking about the functions of bone tissue. We'll look at tissue from a histologic standpoint, or bone tissue, I should say. We'll talk about the maintenance of bone tissue as well, and a little bit about calcium homeostasis as, to wrap up this chapter, because that is an important part of bone tissue as well. And I like to put this picture starting out the chapter, and that's me serving the ball there. I like to put this picture here of a sport because you guys have probably heard before about bone density. How it can change. Athletes, or if you don't necessarily have to be an athlete, but if you're physically active, you will have a greater bone density than folks who are sedentary. And hopefully after this talk and going through this chapter, you'll get a better understanding as to how and why that works, and the importance of that as well. All right. And again, I will be using some images from the histology website that I used for the previous week's lectures in histology. And again, I strongly encourage you folks, go take a look at some of these images on there as well, because the ones I have in here aren't the only ones. So bone is a very dynamic tissue within the body. I mean, most people, when you think about bone, the first things that come to mind are structure and physical protection, which is understandable, because, when we say structure, bones give us shape, essentially. Bones give us, that's how we can, one of the ways we can tell a difference between who we are, identifying differences in facial structure and body structure amongst each other. All right. So skeletons give us shape, physical protection. Bones are, of all the tissues in our body, bones are probably not probably, they are by far the strongest tissue in terms of their overall density, and just how well they are at resisting various forces that can be applied to them. So there are some organs that are protected by bones, some very soft organs, such as the brain, the spinal cord, thoracic organs, okay, some of the reproductive organs, some of the upper abdominal organs are protected by the bones of the body. Okay, so these are, definitely the two most common functions you find within bone, but bones are also important for movement. All right. Now remember, bones basically act as levers. All right. So let's say we've got you've got your humerus here, and then here we've got the bones of your forearm. Again, they don't look like this. We're just doing this for the sake of discussion. And let's say this is a muscle. All right, and we've got a tendon from a muscle attaching here, and a tendon from this muscle crossing this joint and attaching to one of your bones of your forearm. Okay, let's say this would be your elbow. All right, so when this muscle contracts, it's going to shorten, and as it shortens, it's going to pull on this tendon, and that's going to flex your forearm. Okay, so basically, if you want to flex your bicep, that's what's going to happen there. All right, and that's the importance of bones in movement, is they serve as points of attachment for muscles. Okay, it's hard for skeletal muscles to create movement if they don't have anything to attach to. Without bones, we'd just be a glob. All right, so bones are very important in aiding in movement. Bones are also a very critical part of blood cell formation. Okay, now not blood formation, blood cell formation. It's kind of one of my little pet peeves when people say that. Okay, because there are two major components of blood. There's the plasma, all right, which is basically 55% of the composition of blood, which is essentially just water. And then there are what we call the formed elements. Okay, the formed elements are the cells of blood. All right, and that's where we produce them. That's where red blood cells are produced. That's where white blood cells are produced, and that's where platelets come from, but they come from cells that stain the bone marrow called megakaryocytes. All right, and basically these blood cells are coming from stem cells, from pluripotent, very active stem cells that are found within bone marrow. Okay, so very, very important. That's a obviously very important function. Mineral storage. All right, there's a good amount of minerals within bone. Obviously, the most popular one we like to focus on is calcium. All right, but there are other minerals in there. There are phosphates, there's some magnesium, there's potassium. Okay, we can go on. There's a lot of minerals within bone. Okay, but when you take all the, calcium being the most abundant mineral you find in there, but when you take all these together and load them up in a tissue like bone with a bunch of organic molecules like proteins, you make one really tough tissue. All right, again, which gives us this physical structure, this physical protection, and they're strong enough to withstand the force of muscles, so we can generate movement. All right. Bones can play a little bit of a role in electrolyte balance, and I'll talk about this when I talk about calcium homeostasis. All right, because if we run low on, if our serum calcium levels get low, one of the ways we can get them back up temporarily is to strip it out of the bone. All right, but obviously that's not a good long-term mechanism, and you guys probably can already figure that out, as to why that might not be. We can't just sit here and tear down our bone tissue forever, because your bones are going to get brittle and they're going to break easily. All right, but for short-term electrolyte balance, bones are, they're very useful. And bones, there's one major concept you need to understand as we go through this discussion, and that concept is that bones are constantly undergoing something called remodeling. Okay, bones are always basically depositing tissue and absorbing or breaking down its own tissue, right? I'll talk more about the importance of that, but just think that bones are always adding on layers, within themselves, and they're always taking away layers, okay? And as long as this remains and, within equal proportions, bone mass will be fine. Okay, but sometimes this can go wrong, and bones can become too thin. All right, if we break down more bone tissue than we apply, or if we add bone tissue, disproportionately, and there are certain complications that can come with that as well. Like if you pump too much growth hormone in your system after your growth plates fuse. And I'll talk more about that later on. But understand that bones are always under a constant state of remodeling. They're always adding tissue and they're always stripping away tissue. And again, I'll later on I'll get a little more into the importance of that. All right, but these are overall the major functions of bone. And in order for bone to carry out the first few functions that we talked about, we have to talk a little bit about what's within the matrix of osseous tissue. Remember, when I say matrix, that's all of the non-living material basically within the tissue and within the tissue spaces, okay? Now, basically, we can say that bone is about 2/3 inorganic and about 1/3 organic, all right? And essentially, the organic matter is comprised of cells, collagen, and lots of various ground, proteins that make up the ground substance, or the gel-like nature of bone. All right, and the cells essentially, the cells spend a lot of time either producing collagen or just are embedded within the mineralized collagen of bone. All right, and I'll show you some images of cells in a little bit. And then the inorganic matter is primarily the minerals and the salts that we discussed. The most common, common and abundant inorganic material is the hydroxyapatite, basically a form of calcium that you find within bone itself. All right, and for those of you out there who are curious about this, CA10, PO4, OH2. All right. So that's basically the formula for hydroxyapatite. So it's a combination of, it's a combination. It's not just calcium alone. It's a combination of calcium, phosphate, and some hydroxyl groups. Okay, and then when you put these together, then when you take this hydroxyapatite and you combine it with the collagen fibers of bone, you make for one tough tissue. And I'll talk more about how that matrix is put together later on. Okay, but you remember from the histology lectures I did last week that collagen is a structural protein. All right, and being that it's a structural protein, it's a very tough protein. It's very resistant to tensile forces. Okay, so as a result, so as a result, when you combine this tough protein with with all these calcium and other mineral salts, again, you make for a really strong tissue. Now, bear in mind that living bone, I'm talking about the matrix of this, the matrix of bony tissue. That living bone is not like the tabletop that your hands and your computer are resting on. It's not rock solid like that, because you also have to remember another component of bone is water. Okay, there is water within bone. All right, and so the combination, so then you throw water in the mix, and that does allow bones to be relatively flexible as well. All right, and also, as you'll see as I go through this chapter, that that bones aren't, they're not just very solid like the desktops. Bones also are very, they're porous. Okay, bones do have various canal systems and holes within them that does add to their flexibility as well. But you put the two together, you put the combination of this really dense mineralized matrix and the flexibility of bone, you make for one really useful tissue. All right, which gives it very unique and cool mechanical properties. And so, as it states down here, the combination of the organic and inorganic materials and how they're arranged within bone, okay, provides for strength and resilience. All right, and basically, as I mentioned a little in the previous slide, that bones are under a constant state of remodeling. Basically taking away and adding tissues to itself. Okay, basically, it varies the proportions of the components within the matrix. All right, and again, I'll talk more about that later on after I go a little more in depth with bone tissue. Okay. And, next, I just want to mention the cells of bone. I'm going to come back to these as well, when I start talking about bone development, and then, bone, what a bone looks like from a histologic standpoint and the physiology of bone and so on. But the various cells of bone you're going to find osteoblasts, osteocytes, osteoclasts, and depending on what book you read, osteoprogenitor cells, osteogenic cells. I've heard them called osteogenitor cells before. Okay, but in the end, you guys know of the word root osteo is bone. Okay, and then in this case, genesis, basically means to create. Okay, so these are stem cells are going to differentiate into various bone cells that are going to become useful to us later on, and I'll talk more about that in a little while. Okay, so next let's talk about osteoblasts and osteoclasts. Okay, basically when you see osteoblasts, I want you to think of these as the building type cells. So I mentioned before that bones are in a constant state of remodeling. They're adding or building up their tissue, and then at the same time they're stripping it away and breaking it down. Osteoblasts are the building cells of bone. Osteoclasts are the breakdown cells or the absorption cells of bone. Okay, so while osteoblasts are developing bone tissue, osteoclasts are breaking it down. Okay, and then osteocytes. So remember when we talked about connective tissue last week in the histology talk, we mentioned that when connective tissues are developing, okay, all connective tissues start off from some kind of a blast-like cell, a cell that's secreting proteins and developing the tissue, and then eventually, so let's say this is an osteoblast, and it's sitting here secreting out the proteins within the matrix of the cell. All right, and then you start having calcium come in and mineralizing and hardening the cell. Eventually that cell is going to get engulfed within the material of the extracellular matrix, and there's really not going to be any need for it to be continuously secreting proteins and other material into the matrix. So then it's just eventually going to become a functional cell within that tissue, and that's an osteocyte in this situation. Okay. So osteocytes are just cells, are just regular functioning cells that are embedded within bone tissue. All right, they're not really laying down new tissue. They're not really stripping it away. They're just surrounded. They embed themselves within bone tissue themselves. All right, and you'll see the osteocytes when we're taking a look at these various cells underneath the microscope. Okay, and then here's kind of a representation of what these cells tend to look like underneath the microscope. This would be the osteogenic cell. All right, this would be an osteoblast. This would be an osteocyte, and then this would be an osteoclast. Okay, and again, these cells have their appearance for specific reasons. All right, so basically this is essentially this is a stem cell, and then what you see here is you see an osteoblast. Now notice the vast presence of mitochondria and rough endoplasmic reticulum within that cell. Okay, now remember when we talked about rough, the rough endoplasmic reticulum, we said that those are organelles that cells use to produce proteins that are to be transported or exported out of the cell. Okay, so these osteoblasts are continuously secreting, collagen and other proteins into the tissue environments of that bone. Okay, and then eventually all these proteins will become mineralized, and then the cells will just become embedded within its own tissue, and then it won't continue to secrete more and more proteins into the matrix once it's embedded within it. So then they become these osteocytes with these long branching extensions off the cytoplasm, and I'll talk about why these are important. You'll see why these are important a little later when we look at tissue samples of this. All right, and then you'll notice these osteoclasts, okay, are multinucleated cells. These are honestly fascinating cells in my opinion, because what these are derivatives of monocytes from bone marrow. Monocytes are basically phagocytes. Okay, so these, as I mentioned previously, these are used to break down bone tissue, and they do this through a few different means. Essentially, what they do is they either undergo phagocytosis. Remember, phagocytosis is essentially cellular eating. Okay, so they can break down the worn-out proteins or cells within bone tissue, or they secrete a variety of acids within the tissue environment as well. Okay, like lactic acids and hydrochloric acids and so on, and then those acids are used to demineralize bone. So let's think about that for a second. Okay, let's think about that for a second. We're going to do this in a lab. Think about what's going to, remember when I talked about chapter 2, when I talked about the importance of regulating pH and how that affects proteins in the body. Remember what happens if you remember proteins are coiled. They're coiled structures, right? Whether they're long and cylindrical or whether they're globs, they're essentially just coils of amino acids. All right. So remember what's going to happen when you put a protein in an environment that's flooded with hydrogen ions. Remember, those hydrogen ions are going to disrupt the peptide bonds between these amino acids, and what's that going to do to the protein? That's going to make it uncoil. Okay, and then think about what that acid's also going to do, how it's going to disrupt basically the relationship of these proteins and the calcium. Okay, it's essentially going to separate all of these from one another, and think about what that's going to do to the bone. So if I take a bone and I soak it in vinegar for half of a day, and then I pull the bone out, think about what's going to happen to that bone. Okay, think about what's going to happen to that versus if I take a bone and I bake it in the oven for a few hours and I dehydrate the bone and all I'm left with are just the minerals and the proteins. Think about what's going to happen to the bone then as well. All right, so these are the various cells of bone: osteogenic cells, osteoblasts, osteocytes, and osteoclasts. All right. So next, let's talk about basically the formation of, let's talk a little bit about some bone tissue terminology. Before I get into the bone tissue terminology, the bone formation, basically we have to, on this list right now, I just want us to focus on these bottom few terms here: compact, cancellous bones, and trabeculae. Okay, compact bone, I mean, that's pretty straightforward. This is bone that's more dense. Okay, this is bone that's far more dense. All right, now again, it's not a complete solid object because, if you take a look at it, let's say this is a sample of compact bone, you're going to see canals and holes and systems within this bone. But when you look at the matrix of the bone, there's going to be a lot of very, very dense mineralized matrix. Remember that combination of collagen and those calcium salts within the tissue spaces of that bone, and that's going to make for a very hard but yet still flexible tissue. But it's going to be a lot more compact than what we call cancellous or spongy bone. Okay, because when you take a look at spongy bone, again, I'll show you some slides of this in a little bit. It's going to look very well. It's going to look like a sponge essentially. You'll see these what are called trabeculae, these little beams or these little struts. So, for example, this would be a trabeculae. Okay, so basically you see these little beams of bone, woven, okay, throughout the space where the spongy bone is, but there are going to be a lot of pores and a lot of spaces in between these in between these little beams, okay? And then typically within these beams, that's where you find bone marrow. All right, and we'll talk about the importance of that in a little while. All right, and then later on, as we get more into remodeling, I'll talk about the difference between interstitial and appositional growth. Interstitial growth is essentially when bones lengthen. Appositional growth is essentially when bones thicken. Okay, and especially with the remodeling process, this is where we are going to put most of our focus is on how bones thicken. Okay, the next parts I'm going to talk about essentially, from the embryo to the growing child, is going to be more about interstitial growth. Okay, and then these terms up here, I'll come back to these in a little bit when I talk about the histology of bone tissue. Okay, so know that we're going to be talking about the development of bones, and that they're comprised of two primary types of bone: compact bone and cancellous bone, or what we call spongy bone. Some people also like to call spongy bone trabecular bone. It's not a term that's used terribly often. You'll see cancellous or spongy bone used more often. Okay. Now bear in mind that trabeculate is also not a word that's specific to bone either. It can be used a lot with other tissues as well. So now let's start talking about the formation of bone. Okay, and essentially there are two major methods of how bone is formed within the human body. There's what's called intramembranous ossification, and there's what's called endochondral ossification. Okay, now both of these types of ossification begin in what we call the mesenchyme. Okay, the mesenchyme, essentially what this is just a general term for embryonic connective tissue. Okay, and it doesn't really matter where this connective tissue derived from, because there are different levels or layers of tissue in embryonic development. The endoderm, mesoderm, and so on. So essentially the mesenchyme is just a general word for connective tissue, regardless of its origin. Okay, and essentially what's going on here are essentially the cells within the mesenchyme arrange themselves in different fashions and develop differently, and as a result we form two different types of bone. Okay, we form flat bones and then we form long bones. Okay, so intramembranous ossification is all about the formation of flat bone from the mesenchyme, okay, directly from mesenchymal cells. Now, endochondral ossification is a little different. Okay, now the special, you can just take a look at that word and realize the difference, because remember, chondro means cartilage. Okay, so essentially what's going on here is, again, this is still a derivative of the mesenchyme, but what's going on here is we're forming long bones from a cartilage model. So essentially what's going on is we'll form a model, basically a cluster of cartilage, and then bone's going to develop from this model itself. Okay. So keep that in mind. So intramembranous ossification, formation of flat bones; endochondral ossification, the formation of long bones. Okay, so first, let's talk about intramembranous ossification and how this, the basics of how this works. So essentially what's going to happen during intramembranous ossification is you're going to think of this as a development of primarily the cranial bones and the various bones, the various cranial bones and the clavicles. Okay, and there are other flat bones as well, but that's what people tend to focus on when they're talking about this. All right. Now, essentially, when we're talking about this, what we're going to see here is so what you see here with this blue, this environment represents, this is the mesenchyme. Okay, so basically this mesenchyme, it's just it's a bunch of undifferentiated cells, some collagen fibers. Okay, and what's going to start to happen is you're going to start to develop these cells. Remember what these cells are based on what I showed you earlier? These are osteoblasts. Okay, you'll start to develop these osteoblasts, okay? And then what's going to happen are these osteoblasts are going to start to essentially lump together. Okay, they're going to start to lump together, and then once we start to put these all together, this is what we call an ossification center. Sorry, the marker's going a little crazy here, folks. This is what's called an ossification center. Okay, and then these osteoblasts, remember, these are cells that are designed to, build up bone tissue. Okay, they're building bone tissue. So then what they're going to do is they're going to start to lay down bone tissue within this mesenchyme, and then they're going to start to arrange. Okay, you're going to see them start to form this larger arrangement, and you're going to start to see compact bone forming within the middle here. All right, and then notice notice this type of a cell you find here. Okay, within the center. Okay, that is an osteocyte. Okay. Now remember, this bone cell is completely engulfed in this mineralized material. So as a result, it's not going to lay down more tissue. Okay, so when you're looking at compact bone, you're always going to find osteoblasts around the periphery of compact bone and osteocytes embedded within it. All right. So they're just going to continuously lay down, basically these osteoblasts are just going to sit here and just continuously lay down bone tissue. They're going to continuously develop this bony matrix, and then after a little while, what's going to happen are blood vessels are going to start to infiltrate. They're going to start to infiltrate this bone, okay, and then as blood vessels start to infiltrate this bone, okay, you'll start to see the formation of these trabeculae. Okay, you see the formation of these trabeculae, and then. Excuse me. So then what's going to happen, these blood vessels are going to start to wind in between these spaces, or the pores, okay, in between the trabeculae, and then the osteoblasts are on the periphery. They'll just sit there and continuously lay down tissue, and then eventually what you're going to wind up with is you're going to wind up with this woven type bone, and along the outside is going to be compact bone, and then within the middle it's going to be spongy bone, and then on the other side it will also be compact. Okay, and then eventually what's going to happen as as these flat bones become more mature, eventually bone marrow, primarily red bone marrow, then is going to start to fill within the spaces of these flat bones. All right. And this is important because this red bone marrow, this is where the blood cell formation comes in. All right, that's where a lot of our red blood cells are made, is within flat bones. Okay, because there's spongy bone and a lot of red bone marrow in here. All right, so that's the really basics of intramembranous ossification. Again, we just form flat bones. Directly from mesenchymal cells itself. Okay, and then as a result, when all's said and done, this is what it's going to look like under a microscope, and you can see let's go back and take a look at this for a second. The compact bone on the outside here, the spongy bone in the middle, compact bone. So let's jump to this tissue slide. Oops, jumping the gun there a little bit. So you can see on the outside here, this would be the compact bone. All right, and then you can see the trabeculae, okay, the little beams, and then you can see these porous areas, and these are areas that would normally be filled with red bone marrow. Okay, and within this red bone marrow, as I mentioned before, there's what we call hemopoietic stem cells. All right, and large capillaries called sinusoid capillaries. Okay, basically these capillaries, they're called sinusoid because the pores in the capillaries are so big, they have to allow the movement of cells to get into these, so blood cells can make it into the circulation. Okay, and then when all's said and done, this is what you're left with. All right, this is essentially a flat bone. Okay, an outer, an outer and an inner layer of compact, and then this trabecular or spongy bone within the middle. Now, this is really cool because, you're thinking to yourself, why flat bone? Why is flat bone important? Okay, now you have to remember that whether you're looking at the trabeculae or the beams of the spongy bone, or you're looking at the more dense compact bone, these are still very strong structures. Okay, these are both still extremely strong structures. Now, the beauty of the spongy bone is that that allows for strength with a combination of lighter weight. Okay, because you got to remember, I mean, being that we're animals, every organism in nature is always trying. I mean, it's just part of our evolution and part of being a living creature is that we always try to become as efficient as possible. Okay, I mean, we always try to become as efficient as possible. Okay. So by having this spongy bone, we can it gives us a lot of strength, but at the same time, reduces weight. Okay, just makes life a little easier on us. Now, the beauty of this, let's kind of focus on this here for a second as well, because with the strength of spongy bone, it takes a lot, in order to actually break these flat bones. Like, think of a cranial bone, for example. I mean, think of a boxer. I mean, boxers are continuously getting pounded on the head. I mean, they take most of their blows to the facial bones, okay, but you can get punched in the head, up here really hard. All right. How often do you hear about someone getting socked in the head and them breaking the bone all the way through? Okay, I mean, you never hear about that. I mean, someone has to get hit in the head with a baseball bat, or has to go flying through a windshield, or has to have their head hit a dashboard at 75 miles an hour in order to fracture the skull hard enough, or to create enough force to get through here. That's the beauty of this design, is this compact bone on the outside is much more dense, and it takes a lot of force to crack through here. But we have this thicker layer of spongy bone in between, and it's going to take even more force, obviously, to get through that. And then again, you have another layer of compact bone on the underside. All right, so that's going to really do a very good job of protecting our brain and the soft organs that these flat bones envelop. So that's one of the nice things about flat bone is they're strong yet they're light. Okay. So that's essentially flat bone. And then with long bones, this is more of a different process. Now again, as I mentioned, this process begins in the mesenchyme, those various connective tissues of the embryo, except what's going on here is first we develop a hyaline cartilage model, and then what we do is we develop the flat bone around the original model. Okay, now bear in mind that this is hyaline cartilage. Grab either. This is hyaline cartilage. Okay. So essentially, what happens are long bones. They start out as hyaline cartilage, and then then we develop this bony collar. Okay, we start to develop this bony collar. Osteoblasts start to lay down bone tissue around the periphery of the bone. Okay, and then eventually what's going to happen are the cartilage cells some of the cartilage cells are going to start to die away, and then the osteoblasts are going to lay down bone, they're going to lay down minerals along the periphery here. And then eventually at some point in time, the blood vessels are going to start to migrate into the hollow spaces of the long bone. And what you're going to see is you're going to start to see these long bones hollow out, and you're going to form a cavity, which I'll talk about in a little while. Okay. And then the osteoblasts are going to push out to the periphery, and as cartilage cells continue to die, and then you're going to continuously lay down this solid compact bone along the shaft of these long bones. Okay, and then as you can see here, these blood vessels are also going to start to form networks within the compact bone as well. Because remember, I said compact bone has holes in it as well. It's just not nearly as porous as spongy bone. All right, and then what will happen is you'll develop these what's called a secondary ossification center. Okay, and then essentially these secondary ossification centers will continue to allow bone to develop and develop and develop, and then basically once you're born, and as you start to grow after you're born, hyaline cartilage is still left on the ends of the bones, and then you have this plate of cartilage. This is what we call a growth plate, or more specifically an epiphyseal plate. All right, and this is what allows bones to lengthen. Okay, this is what allows bones to lengthen. So essentially, that's where, I mean, again, there's more detail than this, but again, that's how endochondral ossification takes place. You just have mesenchymal cells, jammed together and form chondrocytes, and then you form this hyaline cartilage model. All right, and then again, these chondrocytes continue to proliferate and grow bigger and then die, and then osteoblasts lay down bone tissue along this bony collar, and then blood vessels eventually integrate, and then within the bone, osteoblasts pushed out to the side, and then you develop these growth plates and secondary ossification centers to continue the bone development. Okay, and then as we take a look at the epiphyseal plate, then this is still the most active. This is the kind of a remnants of this embryonic bone development. What this essentially is, this is just a piece of an area of cartilage. Now, in the big long bones of the body, like your femur, your humerus, okay, there's going to be an epiphyseal plate on essentially both sides of the bone. Okay, now if you're thinking of a long bone, like in your fingers, the smaller long bones, there's only really going to be one of these growth plates left within the bone after birth. Okay, so essentially what's going on here then with these epiphyseal plates, what you have here is you have an area called, this is called the proliferation zone. So what's going on here, these chondrocytes, or these cartilage cells, are quite long, and they divide. And remember when we talked about skin a little bit, when we talked about the life cycle of a keratinocyte, we said that skin cells divide and divide and divide, and as new ones, as skin cells in the epidermis divide, old ones are pushed away. All right, same thing with these chondrocytes. Okay, these chondrocytes are essentially, within this proliferation zone, are pushed away from the central aspects of the growth plates and toward the actual, the compact bone itself. All right, and so essentially, and then this is what we call, and number 2 is what we call the hypertrophic zone. Okay, remember hypertrophy, when cells get bigger. You can see the cells getting bigger as we're working our way down into this zone. And then what happens here is you see what's called a calcification zone. Okay, so essentially what's going to start to happen are these chondrocytes are going to start to die, and then as these cartilage cells die, and the cartilage aspects of this tissue is going to start to deteriorate, and then the osteoblasts within the area, they're going to start to lay down, bony matrix around here. Okay, and then that's what we call number 4, then the ossification zone. All right, and this is essentially how bones are going to lengthen, is these cartilage cells are going to continuously push, older cells away from more or less the proliferation centers in the center. And then what's going to happen as these cartilage cells are pushed away and they die, we'll just continuously lay down more and more, bony matrix around these dead cells, and then that's what's going to allow bones to grow in length. Okay, it's going to allow bones to grow in length. Okay, and eventually at some point in time, though, this process is going to stop. All right, and eventually these growth plates are going to ossify. Okay, and they're just going to essentially become continuous with the compact bone and the shaft of the bone. All right, and now, so basically once these growth plates ossify, all right, bones are unable to grow in length anymore, but bones will be able to grow in width. Okay, they'll be able to grow appositionally, and that's the remodeling process that I was mentioning. Okay, so again, this is the really basics of just bone growth, bone development, endochondral versus intramembranous ossification. Okay, and you can see right here as well, you can see the hypertrophy, the enlarged cells, and then you can see the cellular changes taking place as these cells die, and then you can start to see bony matrix being laid around them. So think of this as these cells are dying, and brand new bony tissue is just being piled on top, and as a result, the bone is going to lengthen. Okay, and then at about week 12, this is what we look like. It only takes about 12 weeks to, not obviously this isn't a fully developed skeleton, okay, but we do have a lot of, I mean, you can see a lot of the bones that are, within this. You can see a radius, you can see an ulna, a humerus, you can see the frontal, um, parietal, occipital bones, you can see a mandible distinctly, you can see vertebrae, a femur, and so on. Okay, now bear in mind though, this at 12 weeks, that this skeleton is not bone like you think of as an adult. Even though the bones do lengthen and they take on their shapes, there's still a lot of hyaline cartilage left within the bone, which is important because, and these bones being soft, they do take on their specific shape, but them being soft is to our advantage, because you have to remember there's a lot of rapid tissue growth going on within the body itself. So as we are expanding and growing, okay, the soft nature of these bones will allow organs and tissues that are underlying them to grow and expand as well. And then obviously the soft flexibility of the skull, not going to say it makes life a lot easier, but it does, it is advantageous to giving birth, because the cranium will alter its shape. So the birth canal, it'll bend and flex a little bit, kind of a little cone head shape, and then which does make it a little easier for the baby to pass through the birth canal as well. Okay, so bear in mind that even though at 12 weeks we do look like this, that we don't have a full-on hard skeleton, it's still composed of a lot of hyaline cartilage. And then basically postnatal, when bones grow and develop, basically the only hyaline cartilage that's left then is the hyaline cartilage that's on the very ends of the long bones, and that's within the growth plates, that's making bones grow in length. All right. So that's essentially bone growth and development. And now let's start talking about bone tissue. Let's start looking at this from a histologic standpoint. Okay, and you're going to see some terms, as you're going through your chapter and taking a look at this, that, bone, you're going to see the word lamellae. Okay, that essentially means layers. You'll see that bone cells are going to develop what are called lacunae, or cavities. Okay, cannuliculi, little canals. Okay, then we look at compact bone in the histology of the osteon. Another term for that is what we call the Haversian systems. Okay, and I know these are just words right now, but this will all make sense when you actually see them in front of you. Okay, and then we've already introduced the difference between compact and spongy bone, and talked a little bit about their development and the trabeculae that you find within spongy bone. Okay, so let's talk about the typical features of again, this says typical features of a long bone, okay, but, most bones in the body have these features, okay? It's just that you find, obviously long bones and flat bones are a little different, okay? So long bones just have a little extra. So basically, first what you're going to see, there's going to be compact bone, okay, and then there's going to be the spongy bone. Okay, now this is where it gets to be a little different, because remember when we saw the image of the flat bone earlier, okay, you saw compact bone, and then you just saw, the trabeculae and then the pores. You saw the spongy bone within the center there. All right, whereas with a long bone, you see the organization of this is a lot more complex, okay, but that's important because it has to do with its function. Now, Now, this spongy bone within long bones are going to be located within the enlarged ends. Okay, and the enlarged ends are what we call the epiphysis. Okay, or epiphyses for plural. All right, the shaft of the long bone, okay, is what we call the diaphysis. Diaphysis. Okay, the shaft is the diaphysis. Okay, so understand these terms. Okay, the epiphyses are the enlarged ends of the long bones that contain spongy bone, and the diaphysis are the shafts or the lengthened middle portions of long bones. Okay, and these are composed of an obviously compact bone. All right, now within the shaft of a long bone, you notice that there is a cavity. All right, that there is a cavity, and this takes on a few different names depending on what book you read or who's teaching you this material. I learned it as the medullary cavity. Medullary cavity. Sorry, my spelling is off today. A lot of books like to call this the marrow cavity as well. Okay, so remember the word medulla. Okay, essentially means middle. Okay, and you can see this is a cavity within the middle of the shaft of the long bone, within the middle of the diaphysis. All right, so that's where the term medullary cavity comes from. And then marrow cavity, well, you can see here that this is what we call yellow bone marrow. Okay, so there are two types of bone marrow within bone. I mentioned red marrow already. Okay, now red bone marrow I mentioned is within flat bones of the body, and red bone marrow is also going to be found within the proximal ends of long bone. Now, that's key to that, proximal ends of long bones, not the distal ends, okay? So basically the parts of the long bones that are found closer to the midline of the body, okay? So the proximal end of the humerus, proximal end of the femur are are what you're going to think about with this. Okay, it's not in the distal ends. Yellow bone marrow, okay, this is just essentially fat. It's essentially non-functional fat. Okay, now remember remember fat is a connective tissue, and we said that one of the obviously many functions of connective tissue is just filling up space. Okay, this yellow bone marrow is just within this shaft filling up space. It doesn't really do anything for us besides take up space. All right, in some cases it's been shown if a person is severely anemic, you may tap into this yellow bone marrow, convert it to red marrow, and use it to produce cells, but that's a rare case. Okay, so for the most part, that's just there to fill space and make soup taste good if you cook with if you use bones in your soup. Okay, so these are very common features of long bones: the enlarged ends, the shaft, the epiphyses, the diaphysis, the medullary cavity. And that's full of yellow bone marrow. And there's one other part that I wanted to mention as well, and that is the periosteum. Okay. Now, when you watch the movies and all that, when you watch a movie, and whether it's a war movie, a sports movie, or horror movie, whatever, and you see someone get injured and a bone is protruding out of them, or you see a fresh bone. I don't know if you guys watch those kind of shows or not, but bones don't look white like you think about, like you see on TV. Bones are going to have a greenish yellowish appearance to them. Okay, and that appearance is because of this periosteum. Okay, now remember, peri means surrounding, and remember, osteo is bone. Okay, so what we're saying here is there's a layer of tissue that's surrounding bone. Okay, so you can see right down here where it looks like they're peeling it off of this bone here that there's periosteum. Okay, that there's this outer covering around the entire surface of the bone. You're going to find this around essentially all bones within the body. Okay, so all bones have this thin layer of connective tissue surrounding them. The periosteum is a very, very important part of bone for a few different reasons. One, there are basically blood, as we want to circulate blood into the bone. Remember, there are living cells within the bone. This is how blood vessels start to work their way in. Okay, so basically you see this artery is branching, and it's entering into these holes or these cavities within bones, and those are what are called nutrient foramen, not foreman, but foramen. A lot of people mispronounce that term. Okay, understandably, you're just learning about this stuff. Okay, but let's get that out of the way now. It's pronounced foramen. Okay, now when you see the word foramen, a foramen is essentially just a hole in a bone. Okay, and it's a hole in a bone where a nerve or a blood vessel is essentially going to pass through. It's all a foramen is. Okay, so basically the periosteum is essential to nourishing the bone. Okay, because you can see all the vessel networks within here, and then you can see how this vessel is integrating its way into the bone tissue and throughout the various canal systems of the compact bone to supply the cells. All right, so it nourishes the bone. There are nerves found within the periosteum as well. That's why if you fall down really hard, or if you, let's say let's go with this. Let's say you're walking around and your shin says hello to the coffee table in the living room, or your shin just cranks against something. Okay, and then it starts to hurt. You feel it all the way down to the bone. What you do is that force. That force went all the way down to the periosteum, and you may have caused a little bit of damage. You may have even caused a bone bruise. Bone bruises are damage to the periosteum, and those take a while to go away. Those don't exactly go away overnight. Okay, depending on how hard you hit bone. I've experienced those myself. Not fun. Okay, so the periosteum is essential for not only nourishing the bone and just allowing us to be aware of our bones, from neurologic standpoints. Oops, sorry, I moved the. What's going on here? Oh, my eraser's going crazy. So, all right. So my eraser has a mind of its own. So this periosteum is important. Not just for that, but it's also important because, what was I going to say? Because underneath the periosteum, there are, remember those osteogenic cells? Sorry about that, folks. Sorry about these images going all crazy on us. Let's see if we can move these back. Is my eraser going to work? Nope. Huh, okay. So these so there's osteogenic cells found just between the periosteum and the bone itself. Now that's important for when you break a bone, okay? Because essentially, if I was to break this bone, okay, if I broke this bone and if I snap this bone, I'm going to need to heal it. So then what's going to happen, you're going to start to bleed into this area, and you're going to form this clot. Okay, you'll form a clot, and then these osteogenic cells will form. What type of cell do you think they're going to form into? Osteoblasts, osteoclasts, or osteocytes? Okay. Osteoblasts, remember, these are the building tissues. We break a bone, we need to rebuild that tissue. Okay, so then what's going to happen is you're going to bleed, and eventually that blood's going to sit, and you're going to form this clot and this kind of this callus around the bone, and then osteoblasts are going to start to rebuild the tissue. Okay, and then the osteoblasts are going to start to rebuild around this callus, and then eventually, and then you'll develop new bone around here. And it's very common for, an area where you break the bone to be a little more thick. That's why if any of you are listening, you've ever broken a bone, you feel the exact spot where you broke a bone, you might feel a lump there because of that. That's also why it's important to align a bone properly if you break it, because if you don't, if this bone is crooked, these osteoblasts are going to rebuild regardless. And, it's important that you align that bone properly so they rebuild the bone in as straight a fashion as possible. Okay, so think about these features of the bones that I just mentioned, and let's start talking about the bone tissue. And in fact, I'm actually going to talk about that in a separate presentation.